What happens when the rigid traditions of the Old World collide with the lawless frontier of the New? For the Scots-Irish immigrants of the 17th century, the answer was Francis Makemie. He was a bridge builder who turned a scattered mosaic of fractured congregations into a unified spiritual powerhouse. But to build that bridge, he had to survive Atlantic storms, royal corruption, and a trial that threatened to end his mission before it truly began. The religious landscape of the 17th century American colonies was a jagged mosaic of competing orthodoxies, fractured by the same theological tremors that had devastated Europe for generations. In this volatile environment, the arrival of Francis Makemie in 1683 signaled a transformative era for the Reformed tradition in the New World. Often heralded as the father of American Presbyterianism, Makemie was far more than a mere pioneer. He was a strategic visionary who recognized that the survival of his faith in the wilderness required a fusion of ecclesiastical discipline and civic resilience. Makemie's life serves as a testament to the power of the Scots-Irish spirit, a unique blend of Calvinist fervor, intellectual rigor, and an uncompromising demand for religious liberty. While other colonial figures sought isolation to preserve their purity, Makemie pursued integration, weaving together scattered congregations into the first formal presbytery on American soil. His legacy is defined by a dual nature. He was a humble, itinerant missionary who traversed the Atlantic coast, yet he was also a shrewd merchant and a formidable legal advocate who challenged the overreach of royal governors. By analyzing his formative years in the presbytery of Logan and his subsequent missionary efforts, we uncover the roots of a movement that shaped the American character. Makemie did not merely transplant an old world institution, he adapted the Presbyterian system to the demands of a frontier society, ensuring that the principles of representative governance and doctrinal clarity would endure as cornerstones of the American religious experience. The genesis of Francis Makemie's mission lies in the rugged terrain of County Donegal, Ireland, where he was born around 1658 in the town of Ramilton. To understand the man, one must first grasp the crucible of the Ulster plantation from which he emerged. Makemie was a product of the Scots-Irish or Ulster Scot migration, a demographic shift driven by Scottish lowlanders who settled in Northern Ireland at the turn of the 17th century. These settlers did not arrive merely as farmers, they arrived as covenanters, a group defined by their adherence to a specific covenant with God regarding the governance of the church and state. Makemie's identity was forged in a culture of dissent. In the eyes of the British Crown, particularly during the reign of Charles II, the Church of England stood as the sole legal religious authority. For the Presbyterians of Ulster, this created a reality of perpetual marginalization. They functioned as outsiders in their own land, practicing a faith that emphasized the sovereignty of God and the necessity of a church governed by elders, also known as presbyters, rather than bishops appointed by a monarch. This theological framework, Calvinism, was not merely a set of abstract dogmas for the young Makemie. It was a comprehensive worldview that provided order amidst political chaos. The restrictive laws of the era dictated the trajectory of Makemie's education. Because Irish Presbyterians were officially categorized as dissenters, the path to the ministry was barred within Ireland's established institutions. Consequently, Makemie was forced to cross the sea to the University of Glasgow in Scotland. This period of academic immersion in Glasgow was critical. It solidified his commitment to the Westminster standards and equipped him with the intellectual tools required to defend the faith. However, Makemie's path was not solely determined by academic rigor. At the tender age of 14, he experienced a profound spiritual awakening. Under the tutelage of a godly schoolmaster, he recorded feeling the influence of the Holy Spirit upon his soul. This internal transformation shifted his focus from a mere professional pursuit of the clergy to a missional calling. In 1681, the Presbytery of Laggan recognized Makemie's potential. Colonel William Stevens, an influential member of Lord Baltimore's council in Maryland, had sent a formal request seeking an evangelist for the growing number of Presbyterians on the Eastern Shore. The presbytery's response was the formal ordination of Makemie in 1682. This act was a commissioning into a life of itinerancy and uncertainty. He departed as a man of two worlds, a trained scholar of the old world and a commissioned missionary for the new, prepared to plant the seeds of a structured faith in the fertile, albeit unruly, soil of the colonies. The transition from the structured ecclesiastical environment of Ulster to the untamed American frontier required a fundamental shift in Makemie's operational strategy. In 1683, the 25-year-old missionary arrived at Colonel William Stevens's wharf on the Pocomoke River in Maryland. This arrival was the realization of a specific plea sent 3 years prior by Stevens, a member of Lord Baltimore's council, who recognized that the growing Scots-Irish population lacked the cohesive leadership necessary to maintain their religious identity. Makemie's landing did not represent the arrival of a stationary parish priest, but rather the birth of a nomadic ministry designed to weave together the disparate threads of colonial Presbyterianism. Makemie's initial movements illustrate a deep-seated belief in divine direction through environmental circumstances. After a brief tenure in Maryland, he intended to sail south to Charlestown, South Carolina. However, severe weather forced a change in course, leading him to settle temporarily at Elizabeth River, Virginia. Rather than viewing this as a setback, Makemie interpreted the storm as a providential redirection. This adaptability became the hallmark of his missionary itinerancy. He recognized that the vast distances and thin population of the colonies rendered traditional parish models obsolete. Consequently, he embraced the role of a traveling evangelist, traversing a massive geographical circuit that included New York, Maryland, Virginia, and even the island of Barbados. In 1684, he solidified his legacy as a church planter by establishing the first formal Presbyterian congregation in America at Snow Hill, Maryland. His presence became a staple of colonial life. His sloop, the Tabitha, was a common sight along the waterways, and his horse, Button, carried him across countless miles of inland trails. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of Makemie's ministry was his refusal to rely solely on the financial support of his congregations. He pioneered a model of tent-making ministry. In 1687, he established a base in Accomack County, Virginia, and launched a career as a merchant. This was not a distraction from his calling, but a strategic necessity. By succeeding in the West India trade and engaging in mercantile activities, he generated the personal wealth required to fund his missionary travels. His marriage to Naomi Anderson, daughter of the wealthy merchant William Anderson, further anchored his social and economic standing. Through inheritance and commercial acumen, Makemie became a significant landowner and even a slaveholder, a reflection of the complex and often contradictory social realities of the colonial period. His economic independence granted him a unique authority. He could speak truth to power without fearing the loss of a pulpit-funded salary. Makemie's influence was magnified by his intellectual breadth. He earned the respect of New England's intellectual elite, allowing him to act as a bridge between the Puritans and the Scots-Irish. His arrival became a major event, drawing crowds from all walks of life. Through this combination of tireless travel and intellectual rigor, he single-handedly sustained a fragile network of believers. By the dawn of the 18th century, the scattered embers of Presbyterianism across the colonies required a hearth to prevent them from cooling into isolation. Francis Makemie's most profound contribution was his realization that individual fervor could not replace institutional stability. The transition from independent missionary outposts to a unified ecclesiastical body was born of strategic necessity and a desire to safeguard theological purity. The realization of a unified American presbytery began not in the colonies, but through a return to the Old World. Between 1704 and 1705, Makemie journeyed to Britain to secure the resources, both financial and human, essential for expansion. This endeavor was fueled by the sponsorship of the London Fund, a group who viewed the American frontier as a vital mission field. Makemie did not return alone. He successfully recruited John Hampden, an Irishman, and George McNish, a Scotsman, to join the cause. This recruitment was an intentional effort to provide ordained leadership to churches that had previously languished without professional clergy. By bridging the gap between European resources and American needs, Makemie demonstrated that growth depended on a constant infusion of global talent and capital. In 1706, this preparatory work culminated in a historic assembly in Philadelphia. Makemie succeeded in convening 7 ministers of diverse backgrounds, English, Welsh, Scottish, Scots-Irish, and Puritan, to form the Presbytery of Philadelphia. Makemie's election as the first moderator was a natural acknowledgement of his role as the architect of this union. This body was established with the explicit goal of advancing religion and propagating Christianity through annual consultations. The genius of the presbytery lay in its ability to foster a happy union among various types of British Presbyterianism. Despite differences in regional customs, these men found common ground in the Westminster Confession. The presbytery functioned as a regulatory agency, assuming the critical responsibilities of licensing and ordaining new pastors. The drive toward unity was also a defensive maneuver against the tightening grip of colonial Anglicanism. By organizing into a formal presbytery, these dissenting ministers gained a collective legal and social standing that they lacked as individuals. Uniting the Scots-Irish with the Puritans provided a layer of native-born legitimacy, transplanting a culture of theological debate and accountability. Through this founding, Makemie earned his title as the father of American Presbyterianism, transforming a fragile network into a durable denomination. While Makemie had built an ecclesiastical structure to endure, its resilience was immediately tested by the personal whim of royal authority. In 1707, a legal clash in New York transformed Makemie from a denominational leader into a pivotal icon for broader American religious toleration. This confrontation demonstrated how the principles of faith could collide with the corruption of colonial rule, forcing a legal definition of liberty in the New World. The conflict was ignited by Lord Cornbury, the deputy governor of New York and New Jersey, whose administration was often characterized by corruption and an aggressive preference for the Church of England. In January 1707, Makemie and John Hampden arrived in New York City while traveling to New England. When local Dutch and French Reformed churches requested that Makemie preach in their pulpits, Cornbury flatly refused permission. Undeterred and perhaps unaware of the depth of Cornbury's antagonism, Makemie accepted an invitation to preach at the private home of William Jackson, a local shoemaker. This small gathering of 10 people became the grounds for a warrant for his arrest. When brought before the governor at Fort Anne, the issue at hand was not merely a theological dispute, but a question of jurisdictional power. Did a minister have the right to preach without a specific license from the royal governor? Makemie's initial defense was a masterful appeal to British law. He argued that the 1689 Act of Toleration, which permitted dissenting Protestant worship in the British realm, extended to all of Her Majesty's dominions, including the colonies. When Cornbury countered that the act did not apply across the Atlantic, Makemie produced his existing preaching licenses from Barbados and Virginia as empirical proof. The trial, held in June 1707, after Makemie had spent over 40 days in custody, saw a strategic shift in legal tactics. His defense argued that because there was no legally established church in the colonies in the same sense as in England, the Act of Toleration was technically unnecessary. Liberty was the default state, not a granted privilege. This nuanced legal maneuvering led to his acquittal by the jury. Although Makemie was victorious in court, the victory came at a staggering personal price. He was forced to pay the court costs and travel expenses. The man of God had shown that religious mission and legal advocacy were inseparable in the struggle to define the American character. The physical journey of Francis Makemie concluded in the summer of 1708 in Accomack County, Virginia, shortly after he drafted his final will in April. Yet, his departure marked the transition of American Presbyterianism from a movement dependent on a single charismatic leader to a self-sustaining institution rooted in the colonial consciousness. Often compared to Roger Williams for his fierce advocacy of religious liberty, Makemie's distinction lies in his successful synthesis of freedom with ecclesiastical order. While Williams prioritized the separation of conscience from state interference, Makemie demonstrated that a robust, organized church could serve as the primary vehicle for securing those very liberties. Makemie's influence was not restricted to his sermons or legal triumphs. He was a prolific writer who provided the intellectual scaffolding for the Reformed tradition in the colonies. He authored a catechism that served as a vital educational tool for frontier families. And when it was attacked by the Quaker George Keith, Makemie issued a spirited and academically rigorous defense that won the acclaim of Increase Mather. By engaging in these public theological debates, Makemie proved that the American frontier was not a place where intellectual standards were abandoned, but where they were sharpened against the local errors of the day. The blueprint Makemie left behind through the Presbytery of Philadelphia allowed for rapid expansion as the Great Migration of Ulster Scots accelerated after 1717. As these thousands of new immigrants pushed into the frontiers, the presbytery model provided a mechanism for starting new churches and forming additional regional presbyteries under a central synod. This growth eventually necessitated a formalization of doctrinal commitment, leading to the Adopting Act of 1729. This act officially established the Westminster Confession as the denominational standard while introducing a uniquely American compromise that allowed ministers to express scruples or exceptions to specific points, a balance of theological unity and individual conscience that mirrored Makemie's own life's work. Perhaps the most unexpected facet of Makemie's legacy is the evolution of Presbyterian worship into the broader American camp meeting tradition. The communion seasons brought by Makemie's fellow Scots-Irish involved multi-day gatherings, characterized by intense preaching, repentance, and communal tokens. These seasons provided a vital outlet for religious expression on the isolated frontier. By the 1790s, these traditions had morphed into the mainstay of American revivalism, proving that the rigid structures of the First Presbytery had actually planted the seeds for the most explosive and emotional religious movements in American history. Francis Makemie did not merely plant 5 congregations, he planted a vision of a disciplined, free, and intellectually vibrant faith. As the father of American Presbyterianism, he ensured that the Reformed tradition would not be a historical footnote in the New World, but a foundational pillar of its spiritual and civic identity. As we look back at the life of Francis Makemie, we are forced to ask, what happens to a faith when it loses its institutional backbone? Makemie believed that for a movement to survive the wilderness, it needed more than just passion. It needed order, education, and a relentless defense of liberty. How are those same principles being tested in our religious and civic institutions today? If you value this kind of deep dive into the people and ideas that forged our spiritual heritage, consider joining our community. Subscribe to Theology today.